In this video, we'll be seeing how my 386 struggles to keep up with the games of 1995 and how it's doing in general. But first, let's get an overview of the computing landscape at the time. 95 started out with computers equipping 486 DX266 and 4 MB of RAM in the consumer segment. By the end of 95, computers in the consumer segment tended towards 46 DX4100s and low-end Pentiums with 8 MB of RAM, all with local bus graphics and 14-inch monitors. The general consensus was that the 486 were on the way out, but they were still keeping up with contemporary applications. Windows 95, which released in August, was really pushing the need for 8 MB of RAM even in low-end system. The Pentium Pro was released in late 95, but it was really only suitable for specialized workstations. It was known at the time that 16-bit code just didn't run well on it, meaning that Windows NT and specialized 32-bit applications was more or less required to take advantage of it. That didn't stop OEMs from shipping Pentium Pro machines with Windows 95 though. My 386 is truly starting to look obsolete at this point. Comparing my computer to something in the consumer range, we can see that my CPU is hopelessly obsolete. And from the second half of 95, my 5 MB of RAM isn't looking so hot either. My video card is also on the slower side. Even my hard disk is starting to look quite small, with low-end systems shipping with disks twice the size of mine. And I don't even need to look at other systems to know that my single-speed Mitsumi CD-ROM drive is obsolete. And while filming this in 2025, I was reminded that the hardware is over 30 years old. First, the hard drive started acting up. I actually lost sleep over that, eventually ending up with me staying up all night trying to image the drive. By the time I had an image, it was 5:30 in the morning on a Wednesday, so I headed straight to work from that. I was out of town for a week over the New Year's, and when I got back it took over 10 minutes to warm up the drive to the point where it would pass its self-test. My keyboard also started acting up, at least I think it's my keyboard. I sure will be getting a new computer. Next year. But for 95 it means some games just won't run on my 33 MHz 386. Examples include Command & Conquer, which needs a 486 DX266. Same goes for MechWarrior 2. It needs a DX266. It's worth keeping in mind though that the things I originally did on it still works fine. It runs Microsoft Works alright, and it's not even the worst bottleneck when I try to browse the web using my 14.4K modem. It's really the new game and multimedia applications that are really pushing it to its limits. Well, and Turbo C++ 4.5 for Windows, which I installed in a later video. If all you wanted to do is play games, I can't help but feel that console gamers got a better deal. Although I guess games on consoles were quite different to the types of games you would get on a PC, so it isn't a clear apples to apples comparison. When I got my 386 in 92, the Super Nintendo had just been released here in Sweden. In 95, it was still Nintendo's primary console here, with new games still being released that ran great, unlike new games on my 386. Sure, games were more expensive and maybe not as cool, but the hardware was cheaper and it didn't get obsolete in the same way. And if you were a naughty pirate, piracy was pretty doable on consoles. The Super Wildcard was sold openly here. The press in general had a weird relationship to piracy. They'd talk about the legality or lack thereof, and what a bad person you are for copying games, while also showing you how to do it. They'd tell you that the newest games just wouldn't fit on your expensive piracy device, so you shouldn't bother, while also advertising the size of the game in every review. By 95, that's not to say that the SNES had a long future in front of it, nor was it state of the art anymore. The Sega Saturn, which didn't exactly do great, launched here in the summer of 95. The PlayStation, which did great from the start pretty much, launched here during fall 95. And I guess you could get a 3DO if you really wanted one. On the Nintendo side, Project Reality was just around the corner, and importers had been advertising Japanese pre-orders for months. Imports were somewhat common and readily available here, as quite a few games just didn't get released in Europe. And plenty of devices for bypassing region locks were available. This magazine even reviewed quite a few games not released here, and they also did large pre-release features on games that probably wouldn't even be released here. You could also get region-free SNESs. It's wild to see Shigeru Miyamoto posing with a magazine that you know contains at least one ad for a Super Wildcard. Anyway, this is a video about PCs, so let's get back to that. Looking forwards, it's obvious that the near future was with the Pentium. Intel had two chips on the way. One was the P68, which would become the Pentium 2 and was released in 97. The other was a new, very long instruction word processor, which would be 64-bit and take performance to the next level. It was the next big thing after RISC or something. It was a collaboration between Intel and HP, and Microsoft got on board in '95, who was intending to port Windows Memphis to this platform. This would later be known as the Itanium, and was expected to be released around '97, although it would later be delayed. Apparently, AMD was also gearing up to make compatible processors. With Windows 95 and multimedia getting a bigger presence, tomorrow's CPU just couldn't arrive sooner. Although you did see the occasional Amiga user claiming that the software was the problem, and that Amiga OS could give you that multimedia performance today. By '95, however, the traditional home computer like the Amiga 1200 and Atari ST was more or less dead. It was pretty much just PC left and the occasional Mac user. Macs had a 15% market share in the home here, after all. And then there's those who refused to give up their Amiga, I guess. In Sweden, about 20% of households had a computer, while this figure was closer to 40% in the US. Something that was hard to ignore at this point was that the internet really started to gain momentum. Even in mainstream media, there's a fair bit of coverage of it. It's growing so fast that there is a controversial suggestion to start charging for the registration of IP addresses and domain names. Madness. It wasn't just for nerds now. Established news outlets started up websites, and even some municipalities started putting information online, as well as live updates from the '95 edition of an annual offshore sailing race taking place here. Although I guess museums putting up websites might still qualify as targeting a nerdier audience. As a fun anecdote, there was a bit of a culture shock when Sweden entered the EU in '95. IT systems at the EU Parliament were hopelessly outdated. Communication was mostly done by huge stacks of paper being carried between buildings. Each member of Parliament pretty much had their own secretary to deal with the document handling. While there were computers, they weren't meaningfully networked. Quite a difference if you were used to functioning IT systems and email. Heck, even farmers were starting to get connected here. Meanwhile, experiments with working remotely was ongoing. Concepts like neighborhood offices were tried, and one of the major problems blocking the rollout was the middle manager's desire for control. A neighborhood office in this context is pretty much what's called a co-working space today. There were also risks identified with remote work, that it could be stressful. Working hours and family hours kinda blend together, and knowing when it's time to stop working for the day can be difficult. I made an episode on networking in the last season, and I will revisit the internet in more detail in the '96 season. With the dropping price of Pentium systems and the launch of Windows 95, we saw another cycle of system replacements. While this upgrade cycle certainly sent a whole bunch of computers to recycling, quite a few old business computers came home with those working there. Then there was also the stream of machines heading east. East and Southeast Europe was still a bit of a mess after the fall of the Soviet Union and the events that followed. With more computers just being needed in general, pallet loads of older but functional systems were shipped off in that general direction. A bit like current initiatives like laptops for Ukraine, I guess. If you were in that part of Europe in the mid-90s, how did that all work? What proportion of new to refurbished systems floated about? Any idea of how much of it was retired computers exported from Western Europe, and how much it was just exported e-waste? Let me know in the comments. The launch of Windows 95 was an event impossible to miss, but I'll make a separate video about that. Now let's get to the games. While there were still quite a few games released in 1995 that could run on a 386, finding games in that subset that I actually wanted to play was another story. I guess this is where you'd be pragmatic and look at games released in previous years, but that's not this channel. And when I say run on a 386, I mean at least on paper. But as you can imagine, running games on minimum system requirements isn't always going to be fun. Like always, I based my selection on the following things. A positive review in a Swedish magazine, so 80% or better review score, is something I'd actually want to play, and runs on my 386, at least on paper. I made one exception to that last one, but I'll get to that. Let's get this train on the road with the first one. SuperKarts, a kart racer that plays more like a proper racing game than Mario Kart. It's well within the system requirements of my computer. Well, except for the CD-ROM drive, which struggles a bit with streaming the intro for that. The game itself has a number of different modes, but I'll focus on the main race mode, which is a bit like a tournament. We select a player and is off to race. It's a bit hard to hear with all the unconvincing engine noises blaring through the speakers, but there is actually a soundtrack in this game. Unlike Mario Kart, there are no pickups as such, and no rubber banding. To qualify for the next race, you need to come first, second or third. When you win a race, you get some prize money and an opportunity to upgrade parts in your kart. There is a damage model. If you crash into things too much, you'll lose engine power. While not perfectly smooth on my computer, it does run a lot better than Wacky Wheels did. Next up is Worms, a turn-based artillery battle game with destructible terrain. I couldn't get the full version running on my computer for some reason, but the demo works fine. The two teams take turns trying to annihilate each other, teaching kids important concepts like friendly fire. Aside from a good aim, there is also the increasingly deep craters and winds to take into account. The levels are randomly generated in this demo, but they do follow a few distinct themes. The game itself is kinda choppy, but for this kind of game it's fine. If I had friends, I'm sure I could have some fun with this demo. Next up is Transport Tycoon Deluxe, which is an improved version of Transport Tycoon. The open source remake of this game is one of the things people hyper-focused on before Factorio. It loads most of its runtime data off CD, which takes about 3 minutes on my computer. Eventually, we're in the menu. And let me tell you, this one is rough. My closest comparison is SimCity 2000, which was perfectly playable. This is not. Placing bits of rail is quite fiddly. There is no drag tool with automatic direction like in OpenTTD here. Neither is there for the terrain, you poke at it one tile at a time. No auto slopes or anything, it needs to be level or you won't be putting a track there, or a station. I suspect this would have been quite good fun anyway, if it wasn't so slow. The fiddliness combined with the performance of my 386 just kills the game for me. Next up is Descent. I was very surprised when I saw that this 3D vehicle simulator only requires a 386DX. So was a friend of mine who lent me a CH Flight Stick Pro. You'll need all the help you can get or something. There isn't really that many settings in the game regarding graphics, but I cranked everything I could find down. Despite that, there aren't a whole lot of frames per second. It was surprisingly controllable with a flight stick, despite the low frame rate. It helps that you don't lose health when crashing into walls though. Any actual combat was just completely unfeasible though. Unless maybe if you know exactly where everything was. Another game that I'd like to explore but just don't have the computer for, despite the listed system requirements. I did try to play it with the keyboard too, and it was a bit harder to control than with the joystick, that's for sure. Next up is Bureau 13. This review scores it pretty high, but most reviewers kinda hated it, liking the idea but disliking the poor execution. In many ways, this is like a point-and-click adventure game. It's based on a board game. You start off by selecting 2 characters from a choice of 8. Each of the characters have some sort of special ability. I picked a thief and a mech. You're supposed to investigate some paranormal phenomenon or something. A key objective in the game is to not grab attention. Anyway, another concept is multiple possible solutions. We've started next to a newsstand and we need to obtain a newspaper. You could grab the quarter out of the coin return and open it with that. Or I could use the thief to just pick the lock, or the mech could smash it to bits. I opt to pick the lock and I get a newspaper without spending the quarter. In it, we'll learn about an explosion and there's some evidence collected. We'd like to see that evidence, so we head over to the police station. Since we're not any kind of real law enforcement, we're gonna need to be a bit creative. First, you take the super glue off the desk, and you glue the fire extinguisher cabinet shut. Then you push the ashtray into the trash. And with the clerk out of the way, we can go into the sheriff's office, grab the keys to the evidence locker, and turn off power. And with that, we can grab the bomb fragments and the police report. This game feels a little unhinged, but it seems fun in a way. It runs well enough, but the menu system constantly obscuring what I see is mildly infuriating. Finally, I want to have a look at a game called Backpacker. Technically, my computer doesn't meet the minimum system requirements, but I wanted to give it a go. It's a Swedish travel game, where the goal is to circumnavigate the globe. You don't start with enough money, however, so you'll need to find work along the way. It's really just a trivia game in a travel trench coat. At this first airport, I need to pick my first destination. I choose London. As you might be able to see, my computer isn't really keeping up with it. It's taking a very long time to load stuff. But since this is mostly a game about clicking buttons without any movable graphics, I figured it would be fine. As we arrive in London, we can walk around and see some sights. I then check into a hotel. Unlike a normal hotel check-in, they start asking me a bunch of questions about the UK. Finally, it ends with a geography test, where I need to place a dozen cities on a map. And that's how you check into a hotel, I guess. To earn some money, I look for work. I find this listing, which mentions CNN. Seems like it has something to do with entertainment? No, it's actually our TV repairman listing. So again, it's a trivia quiz with a bunch of AV-related technology questions. It then ends with a reskin geography test, except this time I need to associate an object with a label. This one is a lot less fair though, as the minute of time I have starts counting before it's done loading. I failed this test horribly as a result. It would probably be a lot more fun if it actually ran decent on my computer. Anyway, that's the game pretty much. From here, you go to the airport and pick the next place to go. All in all, I'd say it's pretty obvious that my computer is struggling to keep up with new software, and I am so looking forward to getting a new computer next year. But that'll do for this video. Check back next week when I'll be installing Linux again, maybe for the last time. Until then, thank you for watching.